Father Cyril for presenting me, and I would like to extend my thanks to the organizers of the conference. I'm very much honored to be here. I need to make an important caveat for my talk. I'm talking about the representational sphere, that is about ideology, okay? I'm not doing the fact check of what people are actually saying. So when they are criticizing Constantinople and advancing some kind of accusations or blames, I'm not doing the fact check of whether this actually happened or not. I'm interested in the ideational sphere, in ideologies. As you can well understand, from the Russian perspective, the granting of autocephaly to Ukraine was perceived very painfully and with much chagrin from the Russian political establishment and the Russian Orthodox Church. There is no wonder. What I'm trying to do is to understand why, or rather to understand what kind of main lines of argumentation, what kind of framing is being used in order to understand, in order to process the issue of autocephaly. And my point here is that the issue of autocephaly, the response to autocephaly in Ukraine was built upon the already present ideological grounds. So the response to autocephaly from the Russian perspective did not come from kind of thin air. It was grounded on already established ideology, and this ideology is associated with the conservative turn, so-called conservative turn, which happened in Russian society around the year 2009, 2012, and the Russian Orthodox Church was one of the main sponsors and one of the main creators of this conservative turn ideology. That is why the Russian Orthodox Church has some kind of important stake here, some important stake in. Yeah, is it better? Okay, sorry. What I was saying, just to recap briefly, that the issue of autocephaly is very important and very painfully perceived from the Russian perspective. It is enough to quote from Metropolitan Hilarion. A couple of days ago, he said that what happened in Ukraine in 2018 could be compared with the Great Schism of 1054. So you can imagine the scale of the event in the minds of the policymakers and religious thinkers in Russia. And what I'm trying to do is to recreate ideological grounds on which this autocephaly issue is being built. What I'm going to do is to define three main staples of this ideology, of this bedrock ideology on which autocephaly is grounded. And then I will try to exemplify it by drawing on some specific responses, some specific framing of autocephaly. Speaking about the Russian ideology, I think that it has been defined by three main staples, three main paradoxes. The first one is the problem of Russia being on the periphery. So this peripheral position has always been very painfully perceived by Russian intellectuals. And hence we have messianism as a kind of compensatory mechanism for this peripheral position. Because messianism kind of helps the Russian intellectuals to come up with an ideology which helps them to balm the wound of being on the periphery of sorts, okay? So messianism is a necessary component here. Secondly, and this second point, the second important staple of Russian ideology, it follows from the first one. This is the idea of mimetic rivalry. The point is that in order to fight back the
center, the hegemonic center, be it Byzantine Empire or the West, Russia invented its own and very effective tool, which is mimesis, or simply imitation, okay? This is imitation of the one in power. And this works amazingly good. Just think about Peter the Great, okay? He, by imitating the West, he actually managed to push Russia into the ranks of the first order European powers. So this works. But this mimetic instrument has an important fallout, which is the fact that by imitating, you lock yourself into competition with someone whom you are imitating. That's kind of easy to understand, right? Just think about the level of conflicts with the West. When Russia began to imitate the West, the number of conflicts with the West not diminished, but increased. So this is important. And in order to get out from this vicious cycle of imitation and conflict, Russian intellectuals came up with the idea of isolation, which is the idea that you have to kind of forget about the constitutive important other in order to stop this vicious circle of mimetic rivalry. And the third, final important dilemma or staple of Russian ideology is the paradoxical intertwining of imperial universalism and national particularism. Historically, Russia has always been a more or less universalist empire, a very heterogeneous empire, embracing various nations, races, faith, and so on and so forth. But the secret of Russia's longevity as an empire lies in something else, lies in the fact that Russia used its great Russian nationalism as an important glue which kept this empire together. So you have here two contradictory ideological standpoints, imperialism and nationalism. Okay, having said this, I can now proceed to describe the responses to Ukrainian autocephaly. So far, I can identify three important responses, or three important frames. The first one is the idea that autocephaly of Ukrainian, of Orthodox Church in Ukraine, autocephaly destroys the unity of the Russian world. And I'm going to describe it in a second. The second frame is that autocephaly destroys the historical roots of the Russian civilization, and it destroys the providential, messianic role of the Russian world. And finally, autocephaly is the mischievous encroachments of the Western geopolitical enemy on Russia. Okay, and now I'm going to describe these three responses in more details. The official one, the official kind of master narrative about the Ukrainian autocephaly is the first one. It destroys the unity of the Russian world and Holy Russia. And you can hear this from all possible platforms and outlets, Patriarch Kirill, Metropolitan Hilarion, and all other highest Russian officials are actually arguing in this way. In order to understand this interpretation, we have to understand what the Russian world and Holy Russia means. These are two concepts which were elaborated by the Russian Orthodox Church in the past few years, especially after 2014, the year of annexation of Crimea. But yeah, we can speak for hours about that because they're so important in the Russian context, but just enough to mention that the Russian world is not a monolithic concept. The Russian world has a very complex, meandering history. It emerged in the late 90s and it changed its meaning at least twice. So in the beginning it was the concept of culturally defined Russian-speaking community around the globe with no geopolitical component in it. Then in the 20s it became a kind of soft power instrument of the Kremlin. And after 2014, the Russian world concept changed its meaning again. And the meaning is now the Russian world is a geopolitical entity. You can really spot the places where the Russian world is. Crimea is the Russian world, for example. Eastern Ukraine is the Russian world, and Western Ukraine is not. So you can really spot, you can really draw the line where the Russian world lives. And the second important characteristic of the Russian world in today's understanding is that people belonging to the Russian world should display loyalty to Russia, to political officialdom of Russia. And for that matter, they can seek for protection from Russia. This is legitimate for them to seek for protection from Russia. Another concept is the concept of Holy Russia. Patriarch Kirill was entertaining this concept around 2009, 2011, and this actually meant also a very geopolitical body, geopolitical entity, embracing Russian Federation per se, Ukraine and Belarus. So this was the geopolitical entity, geopolitical body, not a spiritual one. So why is this important? Because when you have these two concepts in mind, the Russian world and Holy Russia concept, the issue of autocephaly becomes the issue of schism and split. For them, the autocephaly of Ukraine means splitting or destroying the Russian world, the organic unity which really exists. This idea of the Russian world and Holy Russia is grounded on some important ideological premise, which is the premise, well, actually a number of premises, but I'm going to discuss only one here. This important premise is the civilizational logic, the logic of civilization, okay? So you have nationalism and civilizationalism as two major geopolitical understanding of today's world. And nationalism implies some degree of republicanism with the people. This is the standpoint of nationalism. For civilizational logic, it is different. It is not with the people. It's not about political agency of us. For those who think in terms of civilizations, you can only belong or betray your civilization. There is it's not the issue of your say, of your political voice, of your political agency. You can only belong or betray your civilization. So in our case, this civilizational logic means that they, the Ukrainians, betrayed their civilization, the civilization of Holy Russia and the Russian world. And the important corollary of the civilizational logic is that civilization is the ultimate sovereign. There is nothing more sovereign than civilization. Well, nations are not entirely sovereign in this sense because you still have the United Nations, you still have some kind of blocks of nations and so on. But civilizations are ultimate sovereign. And why is this important? Because it means that any civilization is exempt from the international normative world order. So you cannot actually say that the Russian world is acting wrong, that it is not democratic enough or not liberal enough, because we have our own norms. So it's very useful concept, as you understand. It's very useful for those who want to prove that, well, we can do whatever we want in our civilization. I think I see, okay, fine. The second important frame of the autocephaly of Orthodox Church in Ukraine is the concept of cutting off, chopping off the cultural roots. This concept emerged around 2014 after a long, long silence which Patriarch Kirill kept after the annexation of Crimea. And this is another interesting issue. Why? In November 2014, he came up with his own interpretation of what happened in Ukraine with the Ukrainian crisis. And this interpretation was the interpretation of betrayal. In his view, the Ukrainians severed their roots, their historical roots. They betrayed their civilization. And by doing so, they kind of forfeited their rights of being the chosen nation, because you remember, Messianism is important here. This idea was elaborated by Patriarch Kirill when he still was a metropolitan, and this idea is that Prince Vladimir, who baptized Russia in 988, he actually concluded a kind of covenant, kind of contract with God, because the Holy Russia is defined by some kind of special spiritual values, qualities. Russians, in his interpretations, have some special qualities. That is, the preference of all things spiritual above all things material. And because of that, the Russians are kind of special, the chosen people. The Russians in the broad sense, including Ukrainians and Belarusians in his interpretation. So when the Ukrainian intellectuals departed from this Russian world picture, they actually forfeited their rights for being chosen by God. The second aspect of this messianic interpretation is something quite amazing for anyone even with some experience of observing Russian intellectual history. This is unexpected unearthing, excavation of the age-old idea of Moscow, the Third Rome. This medieval doctrine is in vogue again in Russia, and the interpretation runs like this. People are recollecting all this story about the Florentine Council and the fall of Constantinople a decade after that, and the Russian Council, which kind of declared its independence from Constantinople and elected Metropolitan Iona as its head. So this was interpreted as the fact that because of betrayal of orthodoxy, Constantinople lost its role as the leader of orthodoxy, and now Moscow came to the fore as the Third Rome, the actual leader of world Christianity. And this ancient medieval idea was revitalized after the events of 2014, and especially after this issue of autocephaly. So now people in Russia are coming up with the concept that Moscow should be proclaimed, just think about, officially declared the Third Rome. This was none other but Roman Silantiev, the deputy head of All Russian People's Council, a kind of pseudo non-governmental organization very close to Moscow Patriarchy, so it's very much into Russian officialdom. And he said that Russia should officially proclaim itself the Third Rome and claim its ascendance in the international orthodoxy. Also it's quite interesting how they weave the story of Stalin into that. And this story is from 1948, when Stalin, by Stalin's initiative, the Council of the Heads of Orthodox Churches convened in Moscow. And what was on the table of Stalin, it was the idea that they should take out the title of ecumenical patriarch from Constantinople and give it to Moscow. And this narrative, this story runs as follows. Stalin, surprisingly, did not display enough firmness in this issue. But had he been more determined here, we the Russians, would have been kind of happier now, because now Russia would have been the actual leader of Orthodoxy, and we would not have this issue with Constantinople and Ukraine. Okay, so this was the messianic side. And finally, the third frame of interpreting autocephaly, this is the geopolitical interpretation. And I must say that this is the absolutely ubiquitous interpretation of what happened in Ukraine, which is common for leadership of the Russian Federation, for the Russian Orthodox Church, and for grassroots believers. It is enough to quote, to give just several quotes, but these quotes could be multiplied. Patriarch Kirill, for example, says that the Orthodox Church in Ukraine is on the side of dark forces. So this was in his recent Christmas interview several days ago, on the side of dark forces, на стороне тьмы, I think that's how he said, on the side of dark forces. Also, Metropolitan Hilarion said that Patriarch Bartholomeus was running errands of his US masters. He also insinuated that he took $25 million from CIA in order to implement this reform. And again, I'm not making my stand and not doing the fact check, I'm just taking it at face value. Alexander Shipkov, he is a quite prominent intellectual in Moscow. He says that this is the clear-cut declaration of war. Another quote. Pyotr Tolstoy, the deputy head of the Russian State Duma, he said that autocephaly is the hybrid warfare against Russia. Alexander Volkov, the press secretary of Moscow Patriarchate, he said that granting autocephaly is the conscious decision of the US government to create the belt of instability on Russian borders. Again, just think about it. He is the mouthpiece of Moscow Patriarchate. And his interpretation is purely geopolitical, just purely geopolitical. Vladimir Vigilyansky is also saying that this is just the geopolitical game, and so on and so forth. This could be like hundreds of possible quotes. So for them, the issue of autocephaly is not about religion and faith. This is about the West and Russia. And the West is the arch enemy of Russia and is always trying to destroy Russia and Russia's importance in the world. Okay, so to wrap this up, I just want to reiterate that the autocephaly was interpreted on very well-established and firm ground of previously created ideology of the Russian world, Russian messianism, and isolationism and anti-Westernism. So nothing really surprising is here in the way how they reacted to what happened in Ukraine. What we can tease out from this is that probably in the future, Moscow will be pursuing the policy of splitting Ukraine. Think about this concept of the Russian world and Holy Russia. Because the Russian world, in its contemporary interpretation, is narrower, smaller than Holy Russia. Because Holy Russia is Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And Russian world is Russian Federation plus bits and pieces of Ukraine, of Belarus, of Kazakhstan, and so on and so forth. So I can I can imagine that in the measurable future, the church leadership would try to readjust these two concepts. And the Holy Russian concept will be more resembling the Russian world interpretation, okay? So I mean that previously the Holy Russia was Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and now I can expect that they will be pressing hard on arguing that that Holy Russia is Russia plus some parts of Ukraine and not entire Ukraine. And what we can see in Ukraine now, I mean, prevention of the parishes from changing their jurisdiction in the east. We can also expect that this would be not just intellectual, geopolitical, or ideological game, but this would be a very clear-cut policy of Moscow Patriarchate. We can also expect that this issue of autocephaly would push the Moscow Patriarchate further towards isolation and confrontation with the West. I mean, the idea that the Russian world is being surrounded by enemies and the increasing feeling of vulnerability of the Russian world. Yeah, so I think that I can stop here. Thank you.